Okay, so now we're coming into the third section of AP World History's third period, which would be, again, 600 CE to 1450 CE. And this one is increased economic productive capacity and its consequences. So we're looking at the economy of these empires that have been created. So the changes in trade networks resulted from and also stimulated increasing productive capacity, with important implications for social and gender structures and the environment. So productivity rose in both agriculture and industry, and the rising productivity supported population growth and urbanization, but then it also would strain environment and at times would cause a lot of significant demographic swings. And shifts in production and the increased volume of trade also stimulated new labor practices, including adaptation of existing patterns of free and coarse labor. You also have social and gender structures evolving in response to these changes. So inventions stimulated agricultural and industrial production in many regions. And agricultural production would increase significantly due to technological innovations. So the first example is champa rice in China. It was a new strain from Vietnam in 1012 that cut cultivation time down from 180 to 90 days. So it basically cut it in half. And food means more people, basically. So you'll have population growth. Then chinampas, which were field systems in Americas, and it was floating gardens that were built in shallow lake beds, and they provided 2/3 of all food to Tenochtitlan, which is incredible. You have waru waru also in the Americas, but specifically the Andean areas, where they were alternating rows of crops and irrigation channels, which limited erosion, because remember, they were in the mountains, and also increased rainwater collection, which is really cool. And then you also have improved terracing techniques, which is all around the world, and they were used to create arable land on mountainsides to also avoid erosion. And they were found throughout the world from the Philippines to Peru. You also have improved horse collars at this point in time to help harness horses. You have a demand for foreign luxury goods. So Chinese, Persian, and Indian artisans and merchants expanded their production of textiles and porcelains in order to export them. And industrial production of iron and steel expanded within China as well. You have the rise and fall of post-classical cities. So some cities would fall while others emerged, and this is basically why. So you've got the fate of cities varying because of rising productivity, expanding trade networks, increased urbanization, stuff like that. Multiple factors contributed to the decline of urban areas, like invasions. So you've got the invasions by the Arabs, the Mongols, the Vikings, the Huns, the Turks, or whoever. You've also got disease. More trade means more disease is spreading, like bubonic plague and smallpox. You have a decline in agricultural productivity in some areas because of invasions and disease. You have an inability to maintain a food base, no people to feed, therefore, why grow the food? You also have a little ice age, so that led to a cooling period, which led to a decline in population and food production. Um, so your cities that fell would be Rome, Athens, Alexandria, Chang'an, Pataliputra. But classical cities that grew would be Novgorod, Timbuktu, Baghdad, Huangzhou, Venice, and Calicut because of the end of invasions. The classical invasions ended, but I mean, some were still to come. Don't worry about that. You had safer transportation, so that was able to have larger empires. You've got a rise in trade and temperature. You had a warming period. Then you have more farms, which equals more people. So more food and peace equals population growth. And then more people equals more people to do the labor, which means more production. Despite significant continuities in social structures and in methods of production, there were also some important changes in labor management and in the effect of religious conversion on gender relations and family life, which we'll talk about. As for labor organization, you have free peasant agriculture, which is what you think of when you hear peasant. It is a typically small farm owning rural farmers. Pretty simple. Nomadic pastoralism, those are your peasants that follow animals from pasture to pasture, following the herd animals. So, like cattle, yaks, sheep, goats, reindeer, horses, donkeys, stuff like that. You have craft production and guild organization. Guilds are collections of craftsmen in a similar trade, and their goal was to regulate their industry. So you would start, so basically, you would want a bunch of experienced tradesmen as like your leadership, but individuals that enter as an apprentice and then eventually becoming a journeyman after a certain amount of time and work, and then become a master after they've created a masterpiece. Often in medieval Europe, that included building like a cathedral or a great church or building of that sort. You got various forms of coerced and unfree labor, like serfdom and mita. So, serfdom was in Japan and Europe, and they worked a specific plot of land for a lord in return for protection. They were the lowest class of feudal society. Mita was an Incan corvée, or unpaid required labor, and it was a tribute owed to the Inca, basically, government. And generally, people did large community projects as opposed to like specific small farming. You have government imposed labor taxes, which were paid to the ruling class, usually a king, and a tax was on land or custom duties, like taxes paid from moving place to place. And it was later replaced with taxes on personal income and property. So we can thank the medieval Europeans for our income taxes today. And military obligations. So, as a part of feudalism, a peasant who worked the land of a lord would owe military service for that lord in return for the land usage. The vassal, so someone who pledged loyalty to a lord, using whatever means they could attain, would have to defend the lord's territory. So this was the primary reason why the lord entered into these feudal relationships, because they didn't have to defend themselves. They had somebody right there to defend them. And largely this would be if somebody was trying to invade their land, whether it's just a local person trying to invade or whether it's an overall invading group, like think the Mongols. Social structures were shaped largely by class and caste hierarchies. Women were able to exercise more power and influence in some areas than others, like the Mongol society, they were able to, West African societies, Japan, Southeast Asia. Women weren't really like thought of as much of an issue at that point in time, so they were able to have a little more power, and quite often they got to actually like learn too. They learned a certain amount as much as they were allowed, which is why in Japan you see like the Tale of Genji, which was written by a woman. So you do see some freedoms for women at this point in time, whereas in other locations like medieval Europe, women don't have really any power. So free peasants resisted attempts to raise dues and taxes by staging revolts. I mean, not a terrible idea. The demand for slaves for both military and domestic purposes would increase, particularly in Central Eurasia, parts of Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Um, I mean, think about it. Slaves or military would help protect your empire. And often think about like the Crusades. They were used to fight other people's battles for them. So free peasant revolts. These are three specific examples that the AP College Board wants you to know. So in China, you have the Red Turban Rebellion or the White Lotus Rebellion of the 1340s. So there was this group of Chinese peasants in the 1340s that were fed up with the Yuan or Mongol rule. And the Yellow River had constantly been flooding along with other natural disasters. And if you remember back through Chinese history, you've got the mandate of heaven, where if you're not happy with your rule, you overthrow it. So a Mahayana Buddhist sect known as the White Lotus Society, who worshipped a mother goddess who would gather her children at the millennium, started the rebellion against Mongol rule. And after 30 years of war, the rebellion was successful. The Mongols were constantly fighting themselves and therefore couldn't handle the rebellion. Because remember, all those fractures within Mongol society, it was not good. So it actually helped out the Chinese really, really well. So in 1368, the Zhu Wanzhang, former beggar Buddhist monk, claimed the mandate of heaven and declared himself the Hongwu Emperor of the new Ming Dynasty. Now in the Byzantine Empire, you have Basil and the Copper Hand in the 10th century. So Basil's most notable physical feature was his copper hand. Well, how did he get it? He tried to impersonate a dead general in order to take power in North Anatolia. Probably not a good idea. His ruse was discovered, and then he was quickly taken back to Constantinople and given history's most infamous slap on the wrist. Without his hand, he had it replaced with a copper one. That's where you get the name. So he looked kind of like a villain. He attempted to lead a peasant rebellion against the Byzantine Empire. He gathered the destitute and downtrodden peasants of the region who were upset at the Byzantine taxes that they were forced to pay. Noticing the lack of tax funds coming in from this area, the emperor sent in the Byzantine army. And used to fighting Persians and Arabs, the peasant army of Basil the Copperhand didn't stand a chance. He was caught, chained, and returned to Constantinople. And after a quick trial, he was burned at the stake. So it didn't work out so hot for Basil and the Copperhand. Now in Europe, in the 1320s, there was a series of small-scale peasant revolts, which joined forces into an all-out rebellion that lasted for 5 years. What drove the otherwise docile peasants to revolt? Taxes. People don't like to pay taxes, like ever. The people were mad at Louis I for raising taxes, so they proceeded to revolt and take over the majority of the Flanders region. They even captured the Count of Flanders, Louis I. This became such a problem that the King of France had to step in and quell the insurrection. And a hastily agreed to peace treaty was signed, but then quickly forgotten as the rebellion continued. And it wasn't until the Battle of Cassel that the rebel army and its peasant leaders were defeated. So these are major examples of free peasant revolts that the AP College Board wants you to know. The diffusion of Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and Neo-Confucianism often led to significant changes in gender relations and in family structure. So in Buddhism, you've got Confucian ideals of patriarchy clashing with Buddhist spiritual equality with little lasting gender change. But you also have foot binding beginning in this period in China. So yay, foot binding. Christianity, you've got Christian convents, like in Buddhism, provided women a way out of the cycle of marriage and child rearing and provided a path to literacy and learning for them as well. For Islam, you've got Islamic teachings of gender equality were overshadowed by Persian traditions of veiling, seclusion, and the harem. But you did also have divorce becoming a practice for both men and women in some Muslim states. And Neo-Confucianism, women were subordinate to men. So these are some wonderful Neo-Confucianist quotes. Disorder is produced by women. A woman ruler is a hen crowing. Woman's greatest duty is to produce a son. And women are to be led and to follow others. So Neo-Confucianism was just great for women's rights. So this is kind of the economic and diffusion summary for the third period, or 600 to 1450.